Yep. Thank you all for coming. I'm so excited to invite you all to this event where we are talking to Lotta, who's the amazing author behind this book, The Observations. And yeah, we're gonna have a little Q&A, and then if you have any questions, we can follow up on that after. And then finally, we're gonna ask Lotta to read a little bit. And I wanted to, this is a question I always ask everyone, how did knitting enter your life?
That's a very good question, and I think we might have similar experiences because all kids in Swedish and perhaps Norwegian schools learn knitting when they're 10, 11, 12 or something. So that was where I learned to knit to start with. But then I started knitting as an adult when I had moved back to my hometown after studying at the university for a few years after graduating, and it actually started with a yarn shop, which I think is perhaps often the case. There was this new yarn shop in my town, and it was just, it was of course full of wool and color and all these gorgeous yarns, and they had a pea green floor, and it was just such a beautiful place to be in. So that was my motivation to start learning how to knit again. And then I started knitting from English patterns because I realized that there was so many patterns that were available in English that weren't available in Swedish. So for many years I never knitted from a Swedish pattern ever.
Same.
Yeah, it's better now.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have more independent designers.
Yes.
Also from the Scandinavian countries.
Absolutely.
I believe that the Scandinavian countries rests on their rich tradition of knitting. So then there's no need to do big changes. But then you get knitters like us who goes like, well, wait a minute.
We can do this.
There's so much more out there. Yeah. Did you have a moment or like an epiphany where you realized you were going to work with yarn professionally, or was it something that just happened?
No, I think that just happened. Basically, there wasn't this one defining moment. I was knitting a lot for myself and learning new techniques and learning more about different types of yarn, and felt that this was where my thoughts went and where my attention went and where my energy went. So that was one thing led to another basically, but that was quite gradual. It wasn't like this one thing that today I'm living this and doing that. Of course that day came afterwards, but it was a decision that had grown for a long time.
I find that with everyone I ask about this, because if you ask children, if you ask children what you want to be when you grow up, you never hear them saying, I want to open a wool shop. And every single person I've spoken to about this find their way in that way. They suddenly find themselves running a wool shop. And there's always a very fascinating personal story behind it, I also find. And that brings me over to, because you run a wool shop. Tell us about your wool shop.
Wool shop. Wolf yarn. That's the next level. Yeah. So I have a small yarn shop in Sweden, in southern Sweden, where I live, called Elk Market Yarn, that I opened in January 2020. I'm a librarian, or I was a librarian after 4 years almost. I think I can finally start saying that I was a librarian. So I worked for many years in different public and academic libraries, and sort of felt that this wasn't the way that sort of opened up ahead of me, wasn't where I wanted to go. So I quit my job and opened a very, very small yarn shop in the middle of the forest where I live. And of all the things I sort of had thought about or planned for when I quit my job that could possibly happen, I mean, a pandemic wasn't one of them. So that was bumping the road, you could say, from the business wise. But it worked out. I had already my web shop in place, and that's thankfully I didn't have a big location in the city, because that would have been very hard. So yeah, that's where all the yarns come from. But I import yarn. We have some similar brands here, you and me, and then I also hand dye yarn. I have my own yarn line called Sagan.
So is there historically, is there like a Swedish wool production happening? You told me, I didn't hear you say Swedish wool.
No, no, we don't have the rich history of wool and wool production and yarn production as we do here in the UK. And what we do have in Sweden is lots of micro mills, but we don't have any big mills that can process enough yarns to sort of sell, like many of the British mills do. They sell undyed yarn to hand dyers. We don't have that yet in Sweden, but there's a lot of things brewing. I think there's a big there's a desire for both international and also domestic customers to use Swedish wool, and there's, as in many countries, lots of Swedish wool that doesn't get used. It gets thrown away. So I think that's about to change, and I'm very excited for what's coming for Swedish wool in the coming years.
Let's talk about designing. At what point did you start designing?
Well, I really like to pick things apart to figure out how they work, and that's basically how I started designing knitwear patterns. I had knitted so many patterns of other designers, and got the sense that there's a code here, and this code is something that I can crack, and I can make it work for myself to do things that I want to make. And that's really a big motivation for me to find the system and to see the structure of a pattern, not just in how the fabric looks when I use these tools we have, but also how the math behind it works out over different sizes. I think that's really fascinating and motivating. So my first sweater design is called Waterlands, and it was actually, I sent it sort of on a whim to Pom Pom Quarterly. They had an open submission call, and they said, "Oh, we love this. We want to publish it." And that was it. So I spent my summer vacation that year learning how to grade patterns, because of course I had only knitted one sample and had sort of notes scribbled down for that one. So that was a kickstart of everything, and it's really so much fun to be designing patterns, and challenging at times.
Tell us about let's talk about observations. How did this book come to be?
Well, I had when I quit my job as a librarian, I started the yarn shop. One of the sort of kind of vague goals for me was that if someone came up to me and said, "Hey, you should write a book," I should have not only the time but also the sort of headspace to be able to do that. But I didn't. It wasn't something I pursued like in a more direct sense. But I did write a few longer pieces for Line magazine. And one day I was talking to Jonna, one of the editors, and she said the magical words, "Hey, have you considered writing a book?" So I said, "Yes, I've considered writing a book," but I didn't know what kind of book I wanted to make. So when I got this question, I sat down and started writing a book proposal, because I felt I needed to have some sort of structure on to which direction to go with this huge project that I thought it was going to be. I didn't realize how huge, how long it was going to take, and I sort of started writing down these ideas about combining knitwear patterns with all the photos that I have taken over the years from where we live in the forest, and also longer texts about things I like to think about when I'm walking the dogs. Basically, very, very sort of down to earth kind of topics. And I just had this book proposal in front of me, and I felt that this is such a weird book. It's the weirdest thing, but I'm gonna send it anyway, and at least I will sort of have tried sending a book proposal to a publisher, and that will be a learning experience in itself. But they loved it, so that's when all the rest of the work started.
Because Observations is very much a love letter to the countryside and the forest. I'm curious to know, were you raised in the countryside? What's your background in terms of why do you love the countryside?
That's a very interesting question, because I'm not really sure what it is or where it comes from, because I grew up in a city, in a medium-sized city in southern Sweden, medium-sized with Swedish standards, not with British perhaps, and definitely not with American standards. My parents weren't very interested in outdoors activities, and we didn't spend lots of time in nature, so I didn't go to the scouts, and I didn't go hiking in the mountains. My dad had a boat, but not the kind of romantic sailboat where you sort of drift away in the sunset, but a motorboat. And my memories of having a boat is my father being down under the floor to fix the motor that had broken down again. So when I was a teenager in high school, I met a boyfriend, and he lived with his mother out on the countryside, and I started spending time there and realized that, wow, you can actually live here. You can live in the forest. You can live somewhere where you can open your door and there are just trees and animals, and when you close the door it's really, really quiet, and in the winter it's really, really dark. And I was just, this was so new to me, basically, and I was just absolutely floored because it was the best thing ever. So I moved out there to the little farm when I was 16, and then I moved around to different apartments in different cities, because when you're a student, it's hard to buy a house, basically. And then I met my husband when I was studying at university, and we moved in together, and he had never lived on the countryside either, and never figured that was something that he might want to do. So we bought like a standard house. It was very practical. I'm gonna read a bit about that later. So we ended up there, and then I sort of felt that no, I need to get away, get out in the forest, and we moved out in 2010, 11 perhaps, and now I don't see that any of us would ever move back to the city again.
Do you think that was like a gradual process, or was there like one moment where you went like, I've had it, I'm moving?
I think it was first gradual, and then it was, this is enough is enough. Yeah. So I started looking for houses or cottages or basically anything, and it wasn't all that easy to find something, and then one day I did find an ad in the local newspaper for a house, and we went to look at it, and it was very, very worn down and very far away from everything, and I think that was like the moment we thought, okay, this is going to be it, even if it's not perfect in any sense, but at least it's not in the city.
It's a starting point.
Yes.
In your book there's a huge emphasis on quiet and calm, and you're talking a lot about listening and noticing the smallest details. That's also reflected in the title, Observations. Why?
I think it needs,
or let me rephrase that, why does this mean so much to you?
I think it means so much to me because it doesn't come easily. If that might sound a bit like a paradox, but I have a very active imagination and a million things going on in my head always at any given moment. I think that I have come to realize that to be able to actually do something with all the ideas and all my thoughts and everything that sort of bubbles and pops in my head all the time, I have to have a certain amount of calm around me. And I think that's yes, I need that to sort of balance out my inner tempo. I would probably burn out in 10 minutes if I lived here. And I also think that it gives you so much to sort of be out in nature and see that things are happening, things are growing, things are nature is alive, not because someone decided that it needs to be alive or that it has a purpose, as a park may have, or even a national park, or of course cities where everything is structured and planned and organized to fit a certain purpose. Where I live, it's not a very pretty forest. It's basically just a regular Swedish forest, and no one has planted the trees that grow there, and no one has decided that we need to do this or that to fit this purpose. Things just grow the way they can in this specific environment. That the seed happened to land here, and it had the chance to grow in this specific direction and in this specific way. And I think that's very comforting and very life affirming, especially as I feel that we live in a society that always values productivity and speed, and being everything we do has to have a purpose. And often that purpose is to make money, either for ourselves or for someone else. So I think it's very valuable for me to live in a place where I can see that there's so many things that doesn't have that kind of value. There are other values in life than being productive and being sort of part of this machinery that we have built for ourselves.
I also think that this is why more and more people are turning to knitting, because it creates a space of calm.
Yes.
And if you are, a lot of knitters are focused on the end product, but if you're not one of those and you're focused on the process, that's exactly what happens. You create this space with breathing and stitches and rhythm,
Yes.
which gives you a break basically
Absolutely.
from everything else.
And it's also, there's a nice kind of resistance in knitting because it's so excruciatingly slow. It's if someone who doesn't knit asks, I'm sure we all had that question, could you knit me a sweater? I saw this nice sweater in 10 different colors, could you knit me this sweater? And we say, I could knit it, but it would take 40 hours, it would take 60 hours, it would take many hours. And of course we also could just go to the shop and
it will take 5 minutes.
Yes, exactly. So I love that it's so impossibly slow to knit, and that we are still so many who do it anyway, because it's not just about the end product, it's about everything involved, anything from choosing yarns and colors and projects to having something that we have spent all this time with, and it's been slow, and we had to rip back and do things over again, because that's how it goes with knitting, and also with life, I think.
So true, absolutely. Being a Norwegian, we were talking about Scandi design and the lack of variation when we were younger, but being a Norwegian, looking through your designs, I clearly see the Nordic influence, especially coming to the color works and the motifs. Would you say that you're conscious about the Nordic roots in terms of influencing your style, or?
Yeah, I think of course I am, because there is, what you grow up with will no doubt affect what you are drawn to, even as an adult, even if it's not something we think about. It's part of what we are used to and what we were sort of given from the start. So of course there are these motifs and certain styles that evokes certain feelings that are important, of course. But since I don't have these childhood memories of going up on mountains and you know, backpacks and stuff, I think my inspiration is sort of one step behind the traditional Nordic patterns. Perhaps that both the traditional patterns and my patterns come from the same kind of landscape and from the same kind of need for a certain set of clothes to protect our bodies from the elements, or and of course to make them beautiful while we do get the warmth or protection from wind and rain. So I think it's more, for me, it's more about having designs that work in the environment where I live, and of course that makes it that means that my designs are they have much in common with more traditional Scandi designs too.
It's interesting that you're saying that. We had a visit from Judith, who done the embroidery on it. Yeah. And we just talked about this in terms of, because we were looking through her swatches, and I was like, oh, these are my favorites. And we were talking about why, and I said, because this is the wallpaper I grew up with. And she was like, me too, and that's why I put it into the design. So I think we do bring with us those motifs or symbols that we kind of evokes emotions from childhood.
Yes,
yeah,
I think so.
Absolutely.
And then we also have all these, I mean, the traditional Scandi patterns, they do come from, I mean, snowflakes or stars, because we do have, at least where I live, we had snow when I was younger. And we do have lots of stars in the evening, and we do have all these, I mean, humans are amazing at pattern recognition. It's one of the things that makes us sort of succeed as a species, and that, of course, we also is something that translates into to designs of everything, but also to knitwear designs, that we can see how a snowflake is built up with the six edges, and we can see the stars form different patterns, and we can see the leaves falling, and we live in a nature which has an abundance of very symmetrical and repetitive patterns in leaves in different shapes, and they change colors. So I think that's one of the most important things to inspire these kind of designs.
That's my questions, actually. Do any of you guys have any questions for Lotta?
Yes. Sorry. You said it took longer than you expected to write the book.
Yes.
How long did it actually take you to write it?
It took more or less 3 years from, not to write it, but from the start of the process to when I had the book in my hand. That was 3 years. So I started knitting swatches and writing the first versions of the texts in 2020, which feels like a lifetime ago by now. And then there were some delays, and I guess there always are when you work on a project this big with so many people involved. So 3 years. So some of these designs have been with me since 2020, and it's, So Helena, you test knitted one of the designs, and you know that we had a plan, and then that plan didn't work. So my test knitters for this book were quite fantastic, because you had to be super patient, and we had it last summer. We had this sort of everything has to be ready now, and then there was a delay with several months. So that was keeping things a secret. It was a good practice for my test knitters for this project.
So when you were doing the book, do you think the text inspired your designs, or the other way around, or not always the same?
I think that they are pretty much different interpretations of the same thing. So I wouldn't say that the texts are about a design, or a design is about a text. It's sort of they all come from the same place. Yes. And sometimes that's not very obvious or I mean that's very hard to to understand how someone else reads your work, of course.
Right.
But for me, it wasn't important to have like an obvious connection between a text about meeting a badger and a spreader called the badger spreader.
You're right.
But I think, or at least I hope, that when people read the texts that sort of belong to each pattern, they sort of can see in the pattern how the text and how the photos belong together or come from the same source, hopefully.
I was going to ask you which language you wrote it in, and because your English is so good, and whether you had any problems describing things in a different language, you know, in English as opposed to your home language.
Yes, that was tricky at times. I did write it in English first because I wasn't sure that it was going to be published in Swedish, and I definitely wasn't sure it was going to be published in Finnish, and I didn't write the Finnish version. We had a good translator who did that. So the first drafts were all written in English, and it was and sometimes, I mean, I tried to describe something that we don't have a word for in English, or I have in one of the chapters I have a small part of one of my favorite poems, and it was tricky trying to find like the right English translation because it's perhaps not a very Edith Södergran is one of Swedish most famous poets, but it was still hard to find a translation, and I didn't want to do a translation of a poem because that's a lot of work that I'm not qualified to do. So that was sometimes it was very tricky, but I had good help of a dear friend who's a linguist, and we had a proofreader who's a native English speaker, and I had help from lots of different people, so that was good. But it was tricky to also to sort of rework the texts into Swedish because it didn't feel as if I was translating my own words. It was rather like writing, when I was in the middle of doing it, it felt like writing another book completely. So I do think they are quite different, even if they of course are about the same thing. They have a different rhythm perhaps, or a different, something's different in them, and that was a very fascinating thing to discover, and how hard it is that some things work really, really well in English and not at all in Swedish. So that was very challenging and a lot of fun to be able to work on these texts in two languages. And it also made me think about how when you must have this too, when we start using a language that isn't our first language, where our thoughts come from, and do we think in this language or that language, or is it a combination, or how do we see things?
Interesting, because I think and count in English when I'm at work.
Yeah.
And as
Nice.
soon as I'm with my family in my home, it's Norwegian.
Yeah.
But do you speak Norwegian
At home.
Yeah.
And I do remember when it struck me. I was at work, and it struck me. I've done all of this thinking in English, which was so weird when that happened.
Yeah.
And then also I think you have this with rhythm and with how you say things differently, because I keep throwing Norwegian sayings to George when we have like conversations, and I'm like, it's like this, and then I will give a direct translation of a Norwegian saying, and then we'll go into like a rabbit hole trying to find the equivalent. Does this exist in English, and how would you say it in English?
Well, that's
So,
interesting.
yeah.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And some are the same, and some absolutely doesn't exist.
Translate.
Yeah.
So, a very basic question in a way. It's also linked to being Scandinavian and English, because I was taught to knit in a different way, and I see people here that
I'm a thrower,
I'm a throwing,
and
and
ask you,
what is the different? Why is it? And do you knit in the Scandinavian way, or
Yes.
do you knit in the English way?
No.
No.
It's funny, but when I'm doing a ferrule, then obviously I do one hand one hand the other. So if I'm doing two colours, I'm knitting the second colour, the contrast, like you would with this hand, and the throw with that hand. Some people use two colours in one hand, so I do both. But
it's interesting because it is a very different way of knitting, isn't it?
and it's the way you were taught.
Yes,
I
it is.
know.
But
Yeah.
where did it come from?
I know the
Why is
story.
it different?
I know the story behind it,
Ah,
and it's a
let's
whole.
hear it.
It's a very common story
Yeah.
when you look at gender and knitting. For instance, a lot of people, you know, you have the when people say, "Oh, only women knits," right? And that's kind of a stupid saying, because originally men were the ones who were knitting and women weren't allowed. As long as it was a profession,
Then it was men.
then it was men.
Yeah.
And as soon as it became a domestic task, then it was women.
Yeah.
Now the story about throwing
Yeah.
is that actually in England also used to knit like we do.
Yeah.
It's a very, very quick way
Is
of
that
knitting.
continental or
Yeah,
is
that's
it,
continental.
because
Also in
sometimes
Italy.
I've watched some pictures of
in Italy we do the throwing.
Norwegians that
Yeah.
is slightly different as well.
So you have
Kind of a
varied,
bit in between.
you have small variations, like the Norwegian pearl.
Yeah.
I'm Norwegian. I've never done the Norwegian
Oh,
pearl.
It
Does it?
Yeah.
But a friend of mine who's born on another side of the country, she was taught the Norwegian pearl.
That's interesting.
But the story about the throwing comes from the Victorian ages, and is actually a husband who found the continental way of knitting not feminine enough.
Ah, so it's
So yeah, exactly. So it's actually more about looking ladylike and looking as you're working less. Because it it was removed from work.
Oh, that is
So
very
it's quite,
interesting.
but it's like you say, but it's in every country. There's
I'm
all
from
these
In
South
South
different.
America.
America, they do
I'm-
pearl
yeah.
and they use their, because
Yep.
if I'm knitting
Slip
ferrule on something that isn't in the round, then I put it round my neck and do Portuguese pearl for the two colour pearl side, and then go back to the frame, but it's
Yeah.
both hands continental, so I use all three if I'm doing
Which is
ferrule
brilliant.
not in the round.
And it's
try
if
not
you
to do that.
struggle with hand fatigue or sore shoulders, It's-
Carpal syndrome.
if you swap between techniques, you
Oh,
get
yeah,
a
it's
less
good.
static,
Yeah.
Flexible.
I had
and it's
a-
better for your body.
I had a friend who had a very bad shoulder injury, and I watched her knit, and she was like, her whole arm used to
Yeah.
go. It wasn't just a hand, and she basically wore through something in her shoulder. It was quite serious, and she had to have some sort of major surgery. And we kept saying to her, "Look, try continental because
Yeah.
you won't be using your arm." And in the end, she did swap because it's so interesting how it uses your whole body.
Yeah, I was about to say that I learned continental when I arrived in the UK. I'm from southern Italy, and then I learned to throw. We have these long needles.
They
So
tuck them
the
under
Victorian
the arm.
story doesn't
Yeah.
apply to me, and you hold one under your,
Yeah.
and then and the funny thing is that initially, because I wanted to learn this new technique, so
Yeah.
also then develop a carpal syndrome, and for me works best, and I learned to knit continental with the very long needles, which is quite interesting. It's just
Yeah,
like,
'cause that
oh,
is
and it's-
different. Yeah.
it is very different, but it's interesting that you're finding what you come, and I was really surprised that everyone says this is the English style. It's not the English style. It's the
Italian.
It's the Italian style. I mean, it's my grandmother and my auntie style. So I think that I'm now really intrigued to find out why in Southern Italy, not in entire Italy, because I know everyone knit that way. But the
Maybe
continental
Greece and Turkey do. because-
Turkey does completely different.
Yeah, they do it in a
But
different way.
this is the one
And there's
thing.
that Eastern Western one as well, don't they? Which is quite.
It's the one single thing that fascinates me the most about knitting is that it cannot be traced to one person.
No.
There wasn't one
That's how
person
it is as well.
inventing knitting.
No.
And that's why we have all the different techniques,
Yeah.
because as soon as you had thread and people start knitting,
Yeah.
so we all do it, all the countries, everyone does it differently,
Yeah.
but the end result is the same.
It's the same.
A
It's a
loop goes
language.
through a loop.
Exactly.
That's
That's what I love about
Mm.
when you look at the charts, yeah, or when you look at the symbols,
Yeah.
they are universal.
Hmm.
And that's what, when I arrived in UK, I already was already a grown-up woman. I had my one child, then my youngest was born, and then my English was not very good. And I said, oh, I want to knit. That was my way of doing something that, you know, I could also approach language, English in a different way.
Yeah.
So I learned how to read the patterns in English and all that. That's why this is one of the beautiful things. And I want to go back to your book on this, because for me, and you know, because I told you a few times, to the point to look like a really like emotional woman. Because I really, about your book, is for me, it's not just about the patterns. You know, I was one of the knitters, so back then I didn't read the book. I didn't know the writing element.
No, you
And
just
when
had the raw documents.
Yeah, and then when the book came out and you started reading, talking about in your newsletters, there was something about the concept and that really resonated with me, part of me, because I live in this big city with a lot of noise, but it was something about that really, and then I found out you are a librarian. I'm a librarian too. So, and then you observe, and it's nature, and it's all going back to a quiet life. So my question is, what of your librarian comes into deciding to quit the job, and then maybe there's something in it? Because yeah.
That's a very, very interesting question that I haven't thought about. But I do think that being a librarian is very much also very much about cracking codes, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have systems. We have our catalogs of books, and they're organized. I mean, at least if we talk about public libraries, which I spent most of my librarian years working in, and we also have this work where we have to be prepared for just about anything. If you work at a public library, you have, especially in this day and age, the public library is sort of the last place where people can just come as they are. They don't have to be customers. They don't have to. Well, you need a library card to borrow books, but you don't need to sign up anywhere. You can just come in. You can sit down. You can read some books, read a newspaper, check your emails on your computer. No one asks what your purpose is if you go back to this. You can just sort
and
of.
there's a calm there as well. and
Exactly.
quiet.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are not many rooms like this left in
that's true.
Yeah.
society where
Yeah.
everything is very.
I think that there is something about that. That's why I was asking
Yes.
the question.
Yes, I think so. And then I also do think that.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Not anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, you're
often.
allowed to do that. You're allowed to go and say, can you speak?
Yeah,
And then
but-
that do create environment
But
for
it is
everyone.
interesting with silence, isn't it? What
Yeah.
it does, because there is
Yeah.
a lot of noise, there is a lot of
Yeah.
talk, and
But then there's a place where, and I think the place I work,
Churches
in
is the
like
other
public
thing,
library,
yeah.
academic libraries, and I do like a different environment now. But it's where you also find people that want to have the same.
yeah,
They want to recreate that kind of environment also in your head.
Yes, and I think that's one of the most central parts where everything connects. That reading is also very slow, and if you're actually reading a physical book, that's what you do. And if you're, of course, when you knit, you can watch TV or listen to podcasts or stuff. But that's the thing you do. It's very very unmodern. It's just doing this one thing, and reading is perhaps even more than knitting. It's very slow and it's very unproductive, at least if you read fiction, and it's very personal, and several people can read the same book and have completely different emotions surrounding it, or different experiences of what it was about even, but then we also have these very big themes that connect us all, and connects storytellers and humans from all different cultures, all different times, all different ages. We have something in stories that is very that is a very basic need for humans, and reading is so I'm still a librarian.
The question is the knitting shows, for me at least, something like
Yes.
Books is how we make sense of the world. Or
Yes.
stories.
Yes, absolutely.
and then you write and you tell a beautiful story with your book, so that's I like to do.
Speaking about reading and stories, could you please read a little bit for us?
I will. My plan was to read the first chapter because it's a quite short chapter, and it sort of sets the tone for the whole book, I think. Do you think we will have time?
Yeah. We'll take time.
We'll see if someone comes knocking at the door.
They have to wait.
In 2010, I was living in a comfortable, fairly new apartment house with a small yard and porch strung together with other identical little houses on the south side of a medium-sized city in southern Sweden. The area was closed off to cars, and kids rode their bikes along the lanes between the houses. There was a playground, and the neighbors all trimmed the bushes together in spring. It was safe, warm in winter, well ventilated in summer, a reliable and endless supply of heated water coming from the tap. But every time I had a few hours between work and studies, I got into our old green Volvo estate, the one we once drove 1,200 kilometers in the summer heat with no air conditioning and 2 dogs in the back to attend a dear friend's wedding in the north of Sweden, and left. I often said in jest that I lived in the city and commuted to the forest, but it wasn't really a joke. I longed for the things most people avoided. A house that required blankets and wool slippers in winter and open windows in summer. A wind that made the curtains move as it leaked through old window frames, being fully in each changing season, the silence and darkness of the night. My husband, somewhat bewildered, saw it all, and soon enough we put our comfortable home up for sale and moved into a very old semi-derelict house. People around us couldn't understand any of it. Why? What would we do there? Why would we trade a nice, comfortable home close to work in the city center for a house 50 kilometers away and 2 kilometers from the nearest neighbor? I didn't understand back then how important and how radical this move was. But as I sit down to write this book, and I find myself going back there over and over. The house we moved into was built sometime in the late 19th century. The couple who built it lived out their days there, and when they died, 2 of their sons stayed on. One of them had died a few years before we got there, and the other one had passed away the year before. He was old, almost 90, suffering from dementia and possibly, as one of the neighbors speculated, malnutrition. Every now and then they would bring him a piece of meat, as he ate only what the small plot of land surrounding the house could give him. Eggs from the chickens, potatoes from the ground, some carrots and onions, honey from the bees. He had worked his entire life at the paper mill in the next village, and when he retired in the 1980s, he stayed on his farm. The house looked just as you might imagine. Our landlord, a young man who had bought it cheap, mainly for the surrounding forest, showed us around when we first went there on an early summer day. The rent was low. They would put up a new roof, he said, take down a couple of walls and strip it out. The old and stained linoleum flooring, the bathroom that hadn't been cleaned for much too long, the kitchen with its cast iron wood stove would get modern facilities. We hardly believed him when he said a cleaning company had already been working there for 3 days. It smelled awful and the dirt felt ingrained. Outside, the garden was mostly an overgrown lawn with weeds and wild bushes growing up above the windows. A honeysuckle had taken over most of the front of the house, spilling up on the wonky roof and pulling the gutters off the rusty hinges. There was a ruin of another structure, an earth cellar, and inside grew the most remarkable damson tree. Beyond what could only with a fair amount of willpower be called the garden, there were piles and piles of firewood, covered with tarp or corrugated steel sheets, each one more collapsed than the other. The barn that had once been the home to a few cows was now falling in on itself, full of broken tools, broken furniture, piles of the local newspaper, random things gathered, collected, hoarded for years and years. Nothing had been thrown away, ever, it seemed. We saw all this and had but one question. When could we move in? Come autumn, the city apartment was sold and our car packed to the brim. We drove out into the forest and haven't returned since. When we arrived, we started sifting through things. It was a treasure chest of junk, so much to throw away or burn, so much to sit with in our hands. A small confirmation Bible dedicated to one of the old man's siblings, the priest's handwriting scrolling over the inside of the cover. Heaps of beautiful old handmade paper from the mill, which I still use for writing letters. We found photos of unsmiling strangers looking sternly into the camera from a time when a photo was an expense not often spared. Sheets and sheets of dry beeswax were uncovered from under stacks of paper and cardboard boxes. We had to burn all the bee scraps after a neighbor told us of a disease that had killed all the bees in the area, but we turned them over in our hands first, and the idea of keeping bees was rooted. Today we have 4 hives in our garden. We also found furniture and kept as much as we could. The desk I'm sitting at now writing this comes from that house. It's heavy oak, painted black but with the color fading, and it must be 100 years old. It will far outlive me, particularly if someone has the sense to keep it and use it after I'm gone from this world. When we clear out a 4x2 meter shed in the yard to make space for chickens of our own, we found a small stove and scorch marks on the ceiling. Did the brothers fall out? Did one of them move into the tiny shed and install a stove for his heating and cooking? A story was hovering right there, just out of our reach. The stove was rusted through and falling apart, so it had to go, along with the garbage bags filled with old milk and egg cartons dating back to 1981, 4 years before I was even born. It was a strange reminder that most people who ever lived are already dead, and that we are here but a short while. Once the chicken shed was emptied, cleaned and painted, we set out to get chickens. We bought a little group of 4, and by midsummer we had fresh eggs and a rooster to herald the mornings. We moved on to the barn to create shelter for sheep and a couple of goats. I put on a face mask and started cleaning out hay that had been lying on the floor and in the mangers for decades. My asthma wasn't pleased, but soon enough 4 Gotland ewes and their lambs moved in. Our other residents were the goat siblings Iris and Joseph, who took only one look at our sad excuse for a fence and walked right out to wherever they wanted to be. Mostly within eating distance of anything we tried to grow. Iris would join us on our afternoon walks to the nearby lake, and if we left the front door open in summer, she'd trot in on her little hoofs and look through the window at her own world outside. Along all this, we had all those piles of firewood to deal with. On first seeing them, we thought it was a great treasure, firewood to heat the little house for many winters to come. But as soon as we started going through the piles, we discovered that most of the wood was soaked through or rotten. My hands quickly learned to tell the difference between a heavy, healthy log that just needed to dry under a roof and one that had been wet for so long the wood had turned into pulp, weighing almost nothing, providing no energy for a fire. We worked on the piles of wood for weeks on end, my husband's body transforming, becoming strong and agile, and soon my own body transforming too. On a cold January morning, I found out I was pregnant. That spring and summer was spent in a liminal space, moving between the old history of our house and a growing of a new life. We lived in that house for a short year, 4 seasons passing, before our growing family needed more space. We found another house, bigger and with the most peculiar details, like the 2 steps of an old staircase leading straight into a wall, and built-in cupboards here and there. We bought it after a single visit. It's in a small village, with a little school and church on one side, and wide fields and the forest on the other. Our kitchen window overlooks the churchyard, and there was a strange satisfaction in realizing we had traded no neighbors for dead neighbors. The house, with all its quirks and flaws, has been our home for the past 10 years, but looking back, I have that first toil-worn place so far from others and so full of stories to thank for almost everything. Somehow, most of the things I've learned about myself, about loving, about being part of nature, about living a life that is small but very real to me, were conceived there. In a way, this book was too, for I feel that it has been with me for far longer than the actual time it has taken to write these words down. I just didn't know back then that all the work and all the choices and a small part of my life spent there will lead me here, to a place where I spend my days writing, knitting, designing knitwear patterns and dyeing yarn. This wooden desk I sit at anchors me in time and allows me to tell you that it is a remarkable thing that you can never quite know where your current state will lead you. It is a song of hope, this book, and a love letter to the place where I live, inspired not by its extravagant plant life or unique fauna, but by simply being what it is and allowing me to make its acquaintance. The knitwear patterns have all been dreamed up right here in a quiet conversation with the land, drawing elements from the natural world and translating them into stitches and fabrics. It is my hope that reading these pages, knitting these patterns, will allow you to grow some roots in the place where you find yourself, whether it's one you were born in and know well, or one you find yourself in by choice, fate, or circumstance. We can start right where we are.
Thank you so much for that, Lotta.
Lovely.
And that's the talk part of our day. So,
This is going to sound a bit ungrateful, but I love your patterns, and I've been following you on Instagram for quite a long time. And I have some of your silver stitch markers.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I love your jewellery. And is jewellery completely in the past for you? Because you make beautiful things.
Thank you so much, and I absolutely hope it's not. It's I decided when I started out, I had, should we do this from the beginning? In 2016 I started making jewelry. I took some classes in metal smithing, and so before I started the yarn shop I already had a very small company where I made jewelry, and when I decided to quit my, because that was just a side job that I did while I was working as a librarian. So when I quit my job as a librarian and started the yarn shop, I decided more or less right away that I would be very careful to not let the work eat all of the joy from metal smithing. And it's been a very hectic year, and I have not had really the space of mind to start working with jewelry, because it's a very quick process if you compare it to knitting and designing knitwear patterns, but it still requires you to sort of be in your hands in a bit more practical way than knitting, because it's you use fire and there's metal and there's shears and pliers and everything, and it's hard work on the hands too. And yeah, so I do hope that I will be back at the bench soon, hopefully this winter, because for some reason winter is my favorite season for making jewelry. And I have just last week I went through my supply of rocks, because I use semi-precious rocks and stones, and just sort of felt that this is something that I'm soon going to be.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you for asking. I'm very happy for this. I try to separate it a bit, because this is really a very personal part of the. Of course, it's still part of the work and life, but it's very personal, and I love that it's so different from working with soft yarn and stitches and.
Just when you talk about elk, we talk about your shop, and I remember your little antler sort of motif, and I think, oh yes, there they are.
Yes, so they're just a small break, or a longer break perhaps, but definitely something I'm.
Well, don't
want
stop
to-
designing knitwear, because we love that.
No, I think that's the thing. If you work in creativity, as we do, those small pockets where you nurture your own creativity becomes so insanely important.
Yes.
Because your job is to enable other people and to kind of like give inspiration and to help people find their and then when you turn back inwards, it becomes very, very precious. Yeah.
Yes, because it is having sort of tending to our own creative selves is something that is so important, and also something that is it's not very it's not something that we're much encouraged to do, is it?
Exactly.
Because it is not productive, and it is not for
It's
anyone
a
else.
process as well. You talked about process before you can make related to knitting, you can be end of the journey person, or if you like the process, that this is part of it, and then you sometimes you don't know why you don't want to specifically do a certain part. You know, in your case, you don't want right now work with your method,
Exactly.
but it's there somewhere, and then you just probably need to follow your heart and
Yes.
see
And it
when
will-
it's coming back in.
It will come back. That's something we learn also from being creative and for letting the creativity take up some more space in our life, that it will always be this wave motion. Yeah.
Right. I think we are now going to open the door back. If people want to come, they can. Thank you all for coming for the talk.
Thank you so much.
We're trying to do more of these kinds of events in the shop, because we do, when you do workshops, you naturally have to charge, because there's a cost involved in teachers and stuff like that. But we try to do more of these kind of like talks, inspiration, and getting to know people, and that's something we can do more as open events. Even though we do close the door.
Semi-open.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And Lotta is going to stay in the shop. We're here until 4 with the trunk show. So, have a blast and squish and ask all the questions and try on everything. And,
We're already done.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm doing the matcha. That's right.